Hi, it's Chris Titley here. As part of the Sub11 podcast, we're joined by Michael Baker, CEO and MD at Arovella Therapeutics. Michael, thanks so much for being part of this series and welcome to Brisbane.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the time.
And Michael, I'm interested to know a little bit about your background, the how and the why you joined Arovella.
Yeah, absolutely. I might start with how I joined and a little bit about my background and then move into the company. But I started my career as a research scientist, as a PhD biochemist, and quickly after postdoctoral studies in Germany decided I'd like to have more impact and get on the front line of helping people. And what that meant for me was to start an MBA and move into biotechnology companies, which I was fortunate enough to do. And while I was completing my MBA, I decided I'd like to have a more commercially facing role and left the role that I was in and ended up in a venture capital fund in Melbourne, Australia called Bioscience Managers. And around the end of 2019, Aravella was looking for a new CEO to join. And after a discussion with the then chairman, Paul Hopper, we decided it was an opportunity to work on what we were currently working on, which was oral spray reformulation, but also take a lens on bringing in technologies really around the cancer space. And so I was happy to join in Jan 2020 around that.
And the move from investing and working for venture capital into now being a hands-on role, how have you found that?
Really good, actually. I think, look, on both sides, it's probably made me sharper. I think I love the buy side. I liked looking through different companies and having a broad lens across digital health, medtech, biotech. But running a company and being deep in a company and really driving it and having the opportunity to influence, shape it, and directly impact people, I think has been tremendously rewarding. We've still got a lot of work ahead of us and looking forward to taking our lead programs into clinical trials in humans. But I think both together, having the background of each is excellent and very helpful.
And Michael, let's talk about the company now, Arovella, what it does and exactly how you're going in terms of the progress.
Absolutely. So what we do is we work on a specific type of cancer therapy called cell therapies. Now, the most well-known to date is something that we refer to as CAR-T. We don't work on CAR-T per se. We work on something called CAR-iNKT. And just to unpack that quickly, it's essentially using the immune cells of the human body, which think about them like the soldiers of our bloodstream. If things come in that don't belong, like infectious diseases, microorganisms, and even cancer cells, our immune systems actually eliminate those things. Now, what happens in the context of cancer is our immune system becomes overwhelmed. And so what we're working on is using the componentry of the immune system, the invariant natural killer T cells, or iNKT cells for short, and genetically reprogram them to give them back to patients as supercharged cancer-killing cells.
Right. And how is that administered?
Yeah, so in the end of the manufacturing, what we do is that actually be given to patients just like you normally would for any other treatment through an intravenous approach. So it's quite straightforward. Once you've manufactured them, it's not too different to other types of treatments.
And I'm curious about the research and development of this particular drug, how that's gone over the last few years to get to where you are now.
Yeah, it's I'd say first it's not for the faint-hearted. So we licensed our technology, which was a manufacturing process from the Imperial College London in 2021. And so what we've done since that time is take the work as it exists in a research state and then take that into commercial environments where manufacturing at scale and doing those sorts of things. So that was quite a lot of effort to get to that point. And a few weeks ago, we announced that we've completed the manufacturing process development and scale-up. And so now we're looking forward to accelerating the process to take this into the first in human clinical trials.
Right. And in regards to what's out there currently as I suppose, a competitive environment with that particular drug, what's out there now and what are you doing differently?
Yeah, excellent question. So as I said before, CAR-T is the most well-known and well-studied. And the way that one works is if a patient presents with a lymphoma or leukemia and they've failed the requisite number of therapies, the physicians and doctors will actually take that person's blood, genetically reprogram the immune cells, the T cells, and then give them back to that same patient. So what that effectively means is it's made for every single person bespoke. And that drives up the costs, the complexity. The patients have already seen cancer and chemotherapy, so the chances are their immune cells are a little bit compromised. and it takes about 4 to 6 weeks to make. So people can actually die while their therapy is being manufactured. And of course, there's always the risk of a manufacturing run failure. So where Arovella really stands aside from others in the field is we work on a different immune cell, the invariant natural killer T cell, or iNKT cell for short. We can take that particular immune cell, genetically modify it, and give it to many different patients. So we use the starting material to get those cells from a healthy donor, then we manufacture, then we can give it to multiple people. So what we're doing is aiming to have an effective therapy that we don't have the bottleneck of supply chain, of manufacturing, and that incredibly large cost burden.
And also time, I would imagine, in terms of what you said, 4 to 6 weeks, in terms of what you're up to, how can that be administered quickly?
Spot on. And so the idea then is when we've finished our manufacturing run, we'll end up taking the therapy, storing it in little vials, stored at very cold conditions, usually in liquid nitrogen. So when a patient is eligible to take the therapy, all we have to do is pull it out of the freezer and give it to that particular individual. So much faster. And we're not at all beholden to a manufacturing run failure because it's sitting in the freezer ready for use.
And can you give the listeners out there a bit of an understanding about some of the recent milestones of the company?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said a moment ago, a huge milestone was achieved for us, which is taking the manufacturing process as it stood on the research scale, so the lab scale, and then taking that into commercial scale inside of a commercial cell therapy manufacturing unit. So the group we work with, it's called Cell Therapies, who are based in the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre in Melbourne. And getting that done to that level, I think the specifications are excellent. So we're now really excited to accelerate, to create what we call GMP material, to do some final studies that we test on that specific material, and then work towards taking that into clinical trials.
And the non-biotech in me wants to ask around the phase 1 trials and how that works, and then what's after that to
absolutely.
Commercial production.
No, excellent. So what we have to do, as I said, is make the batches for clinic, then we test that material with some final studies, and then we submit a large amount of documentation to regulators like the FDA and TGA, and then we get approval to start the clinical trial. So for a phase 1, it's very important to note they are always structured to understand the safety of the product. So we do what's called a dose escalation. So we start at low doses to make sure we're not going to harm, and it will specifically be in patients, I should say, so we don't do any healthy volunteers. The disease is too severe, so we go straight into patients. And then we scale up. So we go from 1 dose level, we go up a little bit and up a little bit again until we start seeing activity with no safety issues. And once we get to that point, then we can, what we do is called dose expansion. So we expand and get more patients at the doses that we're happy with. So they're usually not terribly large numbers, 9 to 12 for that dose escalation, and say 12 to 20 for the expansion phase.
So small numbers, small doses, bigger doses, bigger numbers into phase 2 as well?
Exactly.
Yep.
So exactly. So then once we're happy with that and we've got good data, we'd then move into a phase 2 clinical trial. And just to point out quickly, for all CAR-T, so that's the original version of the therapy that's quite costly, there are now 6 approved by the FDA, and all of them were approved for use in patients after phase 2 clinical trials.
And on that FDA, in terms of your mindset about being global, where do you start?
Yeah, it's a good question, and we haven't put that out publicly, but a very sensible strategy to consider is how to get the best possible clinical trial run, and of course the most cost effective and time efficient. So we're running a couple of strategies in parallel where we're looking at both the US regulator, the FDA, and the Australian regulator, the TGA. But looking at Australia's landscape for clinical trials, it's cost effective. We have excellent centres and sites that generate wonderful clinical data. So it may be an opportunity to say start in Australia and then expand into the US.
And Michael, you did talk about the target market being everyone before, but I'm curious as to know what sort of sub-target markets you're looking at in terms of the size.
Yeah, so in terms of, and the disease for our first product, it's called leukemia or lymphoma. So they're two pretty nasty forms of blood cancer. So in the US, let's say per annum for lymphoma, there's about 80,000 patients diagnosed each year. Now, likely we wouldn't be looking to take that entire addressable market. But for example, CAR-T, as of 2023, the leading product treated 3,000 patients. So we think, we don't know, but that may be a limitation of that supply chain, that it's very complicated and complex to manufacture. So what we'd be aiming to do by having scale when we manufacture this and we're able to give it to multiple patients is to certainly lift the level of access to more patients.
And how important is partnerships along the way in regards to the different types of providers that you can partner with, to get this product to market?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's different partnerships, and I'd say probably the broader word is relationships, and I think they're critical. So we've got good relationships with our manufacturers, both for the raw materials, what we call a lentivirus, as well as the manufacturing of the cell therapy through Cell Therapies in the Peter Mac. And then there's also that strategic element of partnerships, and this is probably more broad and more general, not necessarily Arovella specific, but having partners that you're communicating with to discuss your clinical plans and the phase 2 clinical trials and what comes next is very important, to get their feedback. But what we've seen over the last 2 years or so for cell therapies a lot is that there are either acquisitions, even at early stage, phase 1 or phase 1B, which is where we're aiming to be next. And then there's often an upfront payment to engage in those relationships. And we've seen some recently where the upfront investment into the company, non-dilutive, is upwards of $200 million US. So those particular partnerships are very important. And
you just touched on acquisitions then. Has there been some acquisitions within your sector? Can you talk about them and the activity?
Yeah, there's been quite a lot actually. And for those of you that follow biotech closely, you'll know that the sector's suffered a lot over the last 2.5 years. I think we're starting to see an uptick, but I don't think we're completely on the way up just yet. And in the cell therapy landscape specifically, we have seen quite a number of early stage transactions, whether it's a research agreement or a collaboration or an acquisition. There have been quite a number at phase 1 or phase 1B, as I mentioned a moment ago. And probably one I'd like to call out is what took place in December last year. So AstraZeneca acquired a phase 1B stage company, Graycell, and that was $1 billion cash up front.
Right.
So some of these are quite significant. And again, I don't want to insinuate that that's what's going to happen with Aravella, but what it shows is the appetite for big pharma. It's still there for the cell therapy sector because it is quite important.
And would you call that an early stage acquisition for them? Is that and they would obviously bring their expertise in other areas in research and development of what they're doing? Is that the rationale, I suppose?
I believe that's the rationale in that case, exactly. That it is early stage. They'd like to cement their footprint in this space, and so off they go. They get these technologies, and then scale, cash, and all those other things that they can bring in to nurture these technologies. That's a huge advantage for that company.
And let's get to the milestones for the next year to tick off the list of what shareholders should be looking out for.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to look forward to for the second half of this year, actually. So for ALA-101, that's our lead program being developed for lymphoma and leukemia. So we've got quite a bit to do in terms of manufacturing the GMP runs, interacting with regulators, and getting those regulatory acceptances. So we're expecting to announce those sorts of things. And then we've got some other programs coming up that are a little bit earlier stage, like a product called ALA-105. So this is something we're developing to target initially gastric cancer and potentially pancreatic cancer. And what we're aiming to generate in the next 6 months is some data showing that they're doing what we want them to do in animal models, which we have to start with. And once we've got that, then we'd move into formal manufacturing. So there's quite a lot to do on that front in terms of the development. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we've been a very acquisitive company since 2021. We've licensed 4 technologies in from world-class institutions and universities worldwide. So we will continue to take that lens of finding things that we think either enhance our iNKT cell platform or broaden its utility. Then we'll look to bring those things into the company as well.
Awesome, Michael. Thanks so much for coming in and having a chat today and discussing Arovella, a little bit about your background and the company's background to where they are now, and obviously the future ahead. Thanks so much.
It's my pleasure, and thank you very much for taking the time. Thank you.